We shall lecture in this particular moment on Francis Bacon's New Organon, one of the most dramatic works in the history of Western philosophy and one of the most influential. To understand Francis Bacon's contribution to Western thought, one must begin with his dissatisfactions. Francis Bacon was one of many in his generation who entered a university system that had been essentially unchanged for hundreds of years. The universities of Western Europe had existed above all else to train clergy, and they led students through courses in Aristotelian philosophy and a grounding in that language of natural philosophy that the church and the doctors of the church believed best allowed one to express in natural terms the truth of the Christian revelation, and that passed on the intellectual inheritance of the West that had stood the test of time. But in the course of the 16th century, there is a dramatic revolution in education in the West, an exponential increase in the founding of colleges and universities, an increase in secondary education and in higher education, where the children of aristocrats, wealthy merchants, royal ministers, people ambitious for careers with the new, larger states of Europe, all sought learning, but were submitted to the same education that had been for the training of the clerics of Europe for centuries. And Francis Bacon's life reflected the changes occurring in the audience of higher education. His grandfather had been clerk to a monastery, keeping its books and accounts. His father, loyal to the king, had been given those very lands during the Protestant Reformation in England, when the lands of the church were seized, and had risen to very high political position in England. And his son, Francis Bacon, entered Cambridge University at the end of the 16th century, brimming with worldly ambitions and concerns, but encountering the traditional Aristotelian scholastic education. A contemporary and friend of Bacon wrote that it was at Cambridge that Francis Bacon, quote, first fell into the dislike of the philosophy of Aristotle, finding it a philosophy only strong for disputations and contentions, but barren of the production of works for the benefit of mankind, end quote. And it is that contrast between Bacon's vision of the possibility of works for the benefit of mankind on the one hand, and on the other, his sense of the whole inherited scholastic and educational system and texts of the West as barren of those works, as producing only disputation, debate, contention. One must keep that in mind to understand the intellectual career and itinerary of Francis Bacon. In the early 17th century, even as he begins a political ascent that will lead him to the position of Lord Chancellor of England, Bacon the philosopher begins his momentous assault upon the traditional philosophies. He argued in a dramatic series of works that the European philosophical tradition stood condemned on several grounds, but upon two in particular. One, it had mixed religion and natural philosophy, what we today would term science, to the confusion of both. There was a Christian revelation that had to do with piety, with salvation, with our duty toward God, with revealed mysteries beyond natural knowledge. And then there was natural philosophy, learning what God actually had wrought in this world. The traditional European universities for Bacon, building upon the ancient traditions of the West, had confused these two, allowing religion to be a source of alleged knowledge of the natural creation, and using natural philosophy to discuss things that were, in fact, beyond its powers, beyond its ken. The second great fault of the inherited European philosophical tradition for Bacon was that it had substituted a concern for words in place of a concern for things. The admired masters of European philosophy were not admired because of their mastery of things, but their manipulation of words, their ability to debate, their ability to persuade by rhetoric, to construct abstract and deep-sounding systems independent of the question of whether those systems had in any way captured the reality of the things of this world. For Bacon, European thought had become enslaved to the systems of 5 or 6 Greeks, systems which had infected Europe's relationship with nature. Take almost any contemporary debate for Bacon, or look at the history of philosophy and philosophical debate, and it was not a history of the human mind, debating what we actually knew or did not know about the world before us. It was the pitting of this Greek system of thought against that Greek system of thought. And who were those Greeks? Were they thinkers who had gone out open-mindedly to investigate, hoping they might be proved wrong to advance human knowledge? No, they were people who sat in rooms and wrote words on paper and earned their reputation by words or by the history of their arguments. Bacon wanted to convince his audience, that is to say, educated Christian Europe, wanted to convince a whole civilization that one could redefine the meaning and the goals of human knowledge. And he believed that he could win, first, the interest and sympathy, and then the convictions of that civilization in 2 fundamental ways. First, by convincing them that new kinds of knowledge and new methods of knowledge would make possible an expansion of human empire over the phenomena upon which our suffering or well-being depended. in this world. We needed a knowledge that could change the human relationship to nature, to well-being, and to suffering. And to, and deeply related to this, he believed that he could convince his audience that the Christian ethic demanded knowledge in the service of charity, which meant that the fruits of knowledge were not to be fame, reputation, eloquence. The fruits of knowledge would be the power to enhance the condition of one's fellow creatures, to reduce their suffering, to add to their well-being. He wrote that God himself in the New Testament had instructed us to judge things by their fruits, and that this was true of all human endeavors, including the human endeavor of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, and the use of knowledge. If those fruits, he wrote, were the thorns and thistles of contention and barren, sterile debate, rather than a charity that could alter the human relationship to nature and hence to suffering or well-being, then let that knowledge that produces merely thistles and thorns as its fruits, let that knowledge, in his phrase, quote, be set at naught, end quote. What could be more dramatic? Let all received knowledge be set at naught. Let us begin again. And he undertook his major life's work, the great instauration, the new beginning, a new search for and acquisition of and definition of what human knowledge was and could be. At the heart of that enterprise lay a work with the most audacious imaginable title for the 17th century, a work he called in Latin the Novum Organum, the new Organon. Every student in Europe moving into higher education passed through the philosophy of Aristotle via a set of works collected under the title Aristotle's Organon. It was Aristotle's instrument for acquiring knowledge, the Organon. It lay at the heart of European education. Bacon's audacious work is the new Organon, the new instrument or method for acquiring useful knowledge. It's important to understand the audacity of that system. For the 17th century mind, typical of a traditionalist society, change was always dangerous. If you change the way you grow crops, we all could starve. There could be no harvests because we had learned things that stood the test of time. That's why there was a presumptive authority of the past. Something about the past had gotten us to here, to the present. And we held to those things that stood the test of time. If there had been errors in the old astronomy, the old physics, the old philosophies, over the course of 2 millennia, people would have found those errors, just as they would have found them in agriculture, just as they would have found them in any field of endeavor, from child rearing to mathematics. We were recipients of what had stood that test. Bacon reverses that entire model. The ancients were the children, the childhood, the youth of mankind. We have lived longer. We acquire new experience. We learn, we build upon and alter what they have done. And now we know the sterility of the system that we have inherited. Philosophers have been arguing the same questions with nothing but reputation and temporary fame at stake for hundreds, for thousands of years. And what has it done for human life? Compare, Bacon urged his readers. Compare where, without great minds, without systematic thought, human beings continually improve upon knowledge. What happens? Look at navigation. None of our great minds are engaged in navigation, but look at the cumulative progress. Look at what we have mastered. Look at how we accomplish what the ancients never could accomplish in charting our courses, in crossing the seas. They were the youth of mankind. We are added experience, and with a new organon, with a new instrument of knowledge, we may alter our relationship to the world. The new organon has 4 essential and profoundly influential themes. First, that knowledge is human power. Knowledge of rivers or crops is not a speculative, contemplative knowledge of God's purposes, a speculative, contemplative knowledge of philosophical categorization. It is the ability to harness power, to predict and prevent floods, to navigate correctly, to grow crops successfully, to improve crops and breeds, to avoid human starvation. Knowledge of something is a human power that enhances the human place in the world and that can be used for human charity. The second great theme of the new organon is that there must be a separation of natural philosophy, science, from theology, just as it is not the place of natural philosophers to go beyond the data of the world and talk about mysteries of salvation and the nature of God, so it is not the place of theologians to restrict or influence by their coercive authority the free human study of the world in which we find ourselves. Humility, for Francis Bacon, humility is not submitting to human theological, ecclesiastical authority. It's not submitting to this or that human author. It is submitting one's mind to what God actually has done in the world in which we find ourselves. And so he wrote, let us give to natural philosophy that which is hers, and to theology that which is hers, and not confuse the two. The third great theme of Bacon's New Organon is that the method for the acquisition of knowledge is induction, proceeding logically from the particulars of experience to generalizations about experience that are then tested by experiment. In the system of received authority, we know what is true about the world, and we need deductive logic, as in geometry, to proceed from what we know axiomatically to what follows from what we already know, what is contained within it. For Bacon, that assumption of authority is precisely what he is challenging. The question is not what follows from this or that philosophy taken axiomatically, but what follows from observing the particulars of the world. And when we observe the particulars of the world, we draw from that generalization about oats, and then about grains, and then about agriculture. And because our minds are so prone to error, we must test those generalizations and ask, if I am right about this generalization, what would follow experimentally in this or that situation? And one seeks to prove oneself wrong. And only when one has firm generalizations tested by experience does one then infer from them new, higher generalizations. And when those are tested, yet higher generalizations, as one moves toward an attempt to understand the laws of nature. No one mind can do this. The thought that a philosopher gives us a system of the world is absurd for Bacon. So his fourth great theme is that science is a dynamic, cooperative, cumulative enterprise. Science is dynamic, meaning that it is always correcting itself. It never takes anything as static and as final. It must be cooperative. People must share their data, their experiments. Let other people attempt the same tests. For one mind is so prone to error, we want the cooperation of minds inquiring into nature. And hence, it is always cumulative. We are always adding to human knowledge. Method is absolutely crucial in the New Organon. Without the method of induction and a dynamic, cooperative, cumulative science, genius doesn't matter. In one of his most famous metaphors, Bacon describes method as a path. The right method is a path toward where you want to go. Genius is fleetness of foot. On the wrong path, a genius just gets further and further away from the truth more quickly. But even a plotter with the right method on the right path moves us ever closer toward truth about God's world. Why are we so hesitant to learn patiently from nature by observation, induction, and experiment? It is because, and this is a theme wholly consistent with Bacon's Christian and Protestant philosophy, We are creatures of such pride and arrogance. Instead of weighting our minds down to the world by observation and experiment, we want to fly toward generalizations and systems of the world on the basis of one or two observations. And then, when we do that, we end up worshiping not God's actual creations. We worship what Bacon calls the idols of the mind. Idolatry is a great sin in Christian theology. We worship the idols of the mind, what we have created in our own mind as images of nature, not what God has created and we patiently have studied and learned. There are 4 sets of idols for Francis Bacon. He calls them first the idols of the tribe, the human tribe, the idols that are inherent in human nature, our impatience, our desire to fly to final knowledge, not to be cautious and prudent and careful and suspicious of our own error. We are struck not by the systematically observed, but by something startling or something sudden or something unusual. And we build our theories from those. There are the idols of the cave, the particular biases of the individual human being, resulting from that person's education, that person's psychology, that person's need. The idols of the tribe and cave acting together mean that once someone has articulated a theory of nature or a part of nature as his own, he will seek not to see if it is true, but always to advance it because it is his. The third set of idols are idols of the marketplace, the currency in which knowledge is traded, words. We have inherited words that are so ambiguous in their meaning. We have names of things that we don't know exist. We have words that can mean 4 different things to 4 different minds. And those words take the place of our knowledge of things. And there is what he terms the idols of the theater. Those who we see on stage declaiming to us our received philosophical tradition. The so-called great philosophers worshipped under the notion of authority as if it were Aristotle or Pliny or Ptolemy or Galen, whom one should adore rather than the author of nature known through the careful study of his works. And above all idols of the theater, there is the authority of Aristotle, from which the West must break free if it is to pursue knowledge toward the end of charity of the world in which we find ourselves. Bacon writes a work that is his utopian vision of the world, a work called The New Atlantis. And it deals dramatically with the place of natural knowledge in society. In The New Atlantis, human beings govern their relationship to nature and society by the use of knowledge, and they do this on behalf of their own interest in human well-being and in improvement of the human condition. The instrument of that human betterment was knowledge methodically drawn from patient observation and experiment. At the center of the New Atlantis is the House of Solomon, where the philosophers work with the new method. And over the edifice is the statement of the end to which they are working, which is, quote, the affecting of all things possible. Thank you very much.